morning. Welcome. The Vladimir's Vita was part of the invitation, and you also saw it, and I saw some of you picked it up at the registration. So I will not go through it. He's very well known. Let me mention only that he's deputy leader of the Party of Russian Freedom, better known as by the Russian acronym of Parnas. He's the resident coordinator of Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Open Russia. I say resident because Vladimir actually moved. He lives in Russia now, or rather, he's recuperating, and then he will move there, and we'll get to that in a moment. He's also a Cambridge-trained historian, an author of several monographs, one of which I hope to be able to discuss here. And he is, of course, a prolific and most enjoyable and insightful commentator on Russian domestic and foreign policies, with publications in all leading Western and Russian media. So thank you very much, Volodya, for coming over. We're honored to have you.
Thank you very much, Leon, and thank you to the American Enterprise Institute for organizing and hosting our meeting today.
Volodya, we were all very saddened and disturbed by the news about your mysterious near-fatal illness in the last week of May. Then you were in a coma for quite a while. So what happened exactly?
Well, before I answer your question, I just want to say that today is October the 9th, and today is the birthday of Boris Nemtsov. He would have been 56, and it's the first birthday without him. And there is a Russian saying, as you know, незаменимых не бывает. There are no irreplaceable people. But that saying is not true, because Boris was irreplaceable as a political leader, as a human being, and as a friend. And he inspired so many people with his courage, his vision, and his commitment to always do the right thing, regardless of the price. And in the end, he paid the ultimate price in his struggle for a free and democratic Russia, and we shall never forget. And we now have to carry on the work without him, and we will carry on, but it will be so much more difficult. Now, to your question, as you said, it was last week of May 26th to be precise. I'd just come back from one of my many trips around Russian regions. I was at a meeting in Moscow, and I was suddenly taken ill with an acute intoxication of unidentified origins. I went into a coma. All my major organs started failing, just shutting down one after another: the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, all of it. And in fact, doctors told my wife that I had a 5% chance of making it out alive. So I'm very grateful to be here today, and I'm very grateful for the concern and the support and the prayers of so many people in Russia, in this country, and elsewhere. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody. It really means a great deal. And we still do not know the cause. The poison, the toxin that caused the poisoning was not identified. The tests are inconclusive. So I guess we'll never know the exact poison. But of course, to state the obvious, I'm certain that this was not an accident. This was not natural. And this was somehow connected with my public activities inside Russia.
And I should add, of course, that in addition to being the deputy leader of Parnas, you're also the resident coordinator of Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Open Russia.
Right, the Open Russia movement, exactly.
Well, Volodya, as I mentioned, among many hats that you wear, perhaps the largest is, well, one of the largest, is that of a Russia expert. So let me start with one issue that this town is mostly concerned about these days: Syria. Why do you think Putin decided to go there, and what is his objective or objectives?
Well, I think as with all foreign policy adventures of the current regime, the origins are domestic. And everything this Kremlin has been doing in the last several years, especially since 2011, 2012, when we saw the biggest pro-democracy protests on the streets of Moscow during the whole time of Putin's rule, especially since then, everything they've been doing was dedicated to one chief goal: the preservation of their power. Thank you so much. And that's why I think, for example, that Putin's aggression against Ukraine was not primarily about geopolitics or spheres of influence. What he disliked the most was the precedent of a corrupt, authoritarian ruler fleeing as popular protests were breaking out in the capital city. He really didn't enjoy those pictures of Mr. Yanukovych boarding the helicopter. And what he was afraid the most, and I think rightly, is that a successful democratic Ukraine would be a contagious, bad, in his view, example for Russian society. And I think he was right in that. And that's why he had to do everything he could to try to prevent this success. And so with this latest adventure in Syria, I think the regime needed, frankly, new ammunition for its propaganda machine, which is the main essential pillar, support pillar for the Putin regime. And Ukraine's become a quagmire. The Novorossiya project has clearly failed. The economy is in a free fall. They need something, to oil the propaganda machine, and they chose this. And now, if you look at the Russian state TV news, Ukraine's almost completely gone. It's all about Syria, Syria, Syria. How we're a superpower flying across to the other side of the world, doing what we want without asking anybody, and so on and so forth. Of course, an added bonus to this for Mr. Putin is to help a fellow dictator stay in power. As we know, the informal international club of dictators is a loyal one, and Mr. Putin does not like to see fellow despots lose their position. He's seen too many in recent years, from Gaddafi to Yanukovych. And so we are seeing now that the main targets for Russian airstrikes are not in fact ISIS areas, but the anti-Assad opposition. We've all seen the maps, with Homs and so forth, which is not an ISIS area. But I think there is a potentially a very big problem for the Kremlin here. The problem being that Syria could possibly become, for Putin, what Afghanistan became for the late Soviet regime. A draining and unpopular foreign military adventure that helped hasten the system's demise in the end. And there are already warnings being sounded to this effect. And in fact, there is a new poll by the Levada Center out yesterday, which show that despite all the barrage of the bravado and the propaganda that we see today, almost half of Russians, almost half of respondents are afraid already today that Syria could become what Afghanistan became for the late Soviet Union. So I think, for all the hype that's being put up today, I think that's a potentially big problem for the regime.
Volodya, presidential primaries are starting in this country. You and I talked about that. And unlike Russians, we don't know who the next president will be. So with that uncertainty comes some intellectual work. What would be your advice to the presidential hopefuls of both parties? Let me narrow this a bit. What would you say be 3, 4, 5 things they must keep in mind as they shape and project the Russia portion of their foreign policy message?
Well, I think they're all informed and intelligent people, so I wouldn't presume to tell them something they don't know. But I would
don't presume.
But I would say this: I think many political leaders in the West, including in this country, too many, fall into one of the two extremes when it comes to the approach to the current Kremlin regime. Either they want to make friends with it, or the other opposite is they blame the entire Russian nation for the actions of this unelected authoritarian system. And I think it's the most important thing for policymakers and presidential candidates is to recognize the situation as it is. And the fact is that Russia today is ruled by an unaccountable, unelected, dictatorial regime. And if history teaches us anything, it's that making friends with such regimes and closing eyes on their abuses is not a sound long-term strategy. And unfortunately, we've seen administrations of both parties in this town try to do this. Remember President Bush famously looking into Putin's eyes and seeing his soul. We remember the reset policy of the current President Barack Obama. So I think if values, if principles on which this nation was founded still mean something for political leaders, it's those values that should inform the attitude towards a regime that routinely abuses the rights of its own citizens and now also the borders and sovereignty of other nations. And short-term deals with such regimes at the expense of fundamental values, I don't think are the answer. I think the answer ultimately lies in democracy and rule of law in Russia itself. And the fact is that Russia deserves better than what we have today. And the fact is that Russia is not destined to remain under this system forever. And I think it's very important for policymakers to have this understanding and to recognize this above all when they shape the policy.
Thank you very much. Now, let me broaden this issue a little bit. No matter who the next president will be, one thing I think we can be sure of, and you alluded to it, like all US presidents from both parties, pretty much since the establishment of the diplomatic relations between the United States and Soviet Union in 1933, she or he would wish two things for Russia: to be prosperous and to be free. What can the United States do to further the emergence of such a Russia?
Well, I think first of all, I'd like to say that it's our job to bring democratic changes to our country, no one else's. And I don't think it can be done from outside. I don't think it should be done from the outside. It's for us to do. But if the US wants to show solidarity with those people in Russia who want a future based on democracy and rule of law, I think the main thing it could do is to stand by and abide by its own fundamental principles. To speak openly and frankly about the abuses of the Kremlin regime, not to close their eyes on it, not to pretend that the corrupt dictator in the Kremlin is a partner. At the same time, differentiate and emphasize this differentiation between the Kremlin regime and Russia, and maintain lines of communication with civil society in Russia, with the democratic movement in Russia, and very importantly, keep out the prospect of a future democratic Russia being an equal partner on the world stage. That's a very important prospect to have and to put out. But I think most importantly is practice the principles you preach, frankly. And I'll give one example. There is a law on the books in the United States, the Magnitsky Act, which was passed nearly 3 years ago. Passed with unseen or rarely seen bipartisan majorities in both houses of Congress, signed by President Obama in December 2012. I think one of the most principled and honorable pieces of legislation ever passed in any foreign parliament. It's, as you know, of course, it's designed to end the impunity for those who continue to abuse the rights and freedoms of Russian citizens and steal the money of Russian taxpayers by denying them the privilege of traveling to and owing assets in this country. A privilege, I should add, they so greatly enjoy. For all the many similarities we can discuss with the Soviet regime, there is one major difference with this one. You know, Brezhnev, Suslov, and Andropov did not buy yachts, hold bank accounts, or send their kids to study in the democratic West. This bunch do. And so I think ending this double standard is a very important way for the US to show solidarity with those in Russia who struggle for a democratic future. Frankly, almost 3 years after this law has been passed and signed, implementation remains pretty timid. And so far, we've seen only low-level abusers targeted. So I think it's important for the US to step up and be more bold and more forthcoming and target some more prominent and influential people. And one idea that former Prime Minister Kasyanov and I suggested earlier this year, we came to this town and met with congressional leaders, was to include the officials from the state propaganda machine for their public incitement against the late Boris Nemtsov in the month leading up to his murder. The incitement that created this atmosphere that made it possible to murder the leader of the opposition 200 yards away from the Kremlin. And I should add that this law and these personal targeted sanctions on abusers and corrupt officials are very popular with the Russian people. Despite all of its propaganda possibilities, the regime has failed to present the Magnitsky process as, quote, sanctions against Russia. People understand that, targeting those who abuse their rights and steal their money, that's not sanctions against Russia. That's a pro-Russian measure. And so even despite the situation today, these measures are very popular with the citizens of Russia, and I think it would be really important if the US and hopefully also the European Union afterwards would follow up and be more bold in its implementation.
Well, let's talk a little bit about a subject you know so well, intimately, I would say, the domestic politics and the policies of the regime. Local elections were held last month. Your party, Parnas, was the only opposition party, and I'm not counting the ones in the rubber stamp. It was the only party that was allowed to participate, but then only, ultimately, in one region of Russia, Kostroma, one of Russia's 85 regions. So on the one hand, I guess congratulations are in order. On the other hand, given that it was only in one region and that your candidate got less than 2% of the vote, that seems like another sign of the consolidation of the Putin dictatorship. Now, at the same time, though, your recent interview with Moskovsky Komsomolets was very interesting because, among other things, you said that these restrictions are the regime of, the evidence of regime's weakness and fear. Could you explain to us what happened exactly, and why do you think the regime is in that position?
Sure, thanks for the question. And I think it's important to always remember, as you rightly pointed out, that in the vast majority of cases, Russian citizens do not get a real choice at the ballot box, do not get a real alternative. In the rare cases when they do, the opposition often scores very significant results, such as when Alexei Navalny got nearly 30% of the vote in Moscow 2 years ago, or when Boris Nemtsov was elected as the head of the Parnas ticket in Yaroslavl also 2 years ago. But in most cases, Russian voters are stuck with a pre-selected pool of pro-Kremlin parties, or Robostan parties as you call them. And in these recent local and municipal elections that were held in September, our party, Parnas, was prevented from running in the Novosibirsk region, in the Kaluga region, in the Magadan region, for the city Duma in Nizhny Novgorod. So this is the usual pattern of behavior for this regime. They bar genuine opposition from the ballot. They harass independent election monitors. They ban or disperse opposition rallies, and generally try to stifle and prevent and block any manifestation of independent civic activity, anything that doesn't, conform to their goals. For example, as you mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the Open Russia movement, and one of my main tasks is to organize public events around Russia, much as this one, discussions, seminars, lectures. We're trying to recreate this space for public discussion, for free and unfettered public discussion that's been so limited by this regime. And almost every time that we hold such events, we get police seizing the building. We have, it being announced that the building is bombed, the electricity goes out, all the rest of it. Every time they try to do something to prevent, our events from happening. Every time they try to do something to stop us from going ahead. And in this election in Kostroma that you mentioned, Open Russia had a pretty big vote monitoring operation. We sent a vote monitoring mission to Kostroma. This was a pilot project for us. We're going to hopefully expand on this for next year's State Duma election and do it nationwide. But this was kind of the pilot version. And on voting day itself, we had an armed police squad block our headquarters. Ostensibly they were looking for a dead body inside our vote monitoring mission. Of course, they didn't find a dead body, but what they did do was detain and question our coordinators, our monitors, and basically sabotage the mission. Now, in my mind, this is not the behavior of a strong, popular, and self-confident government. This is the behavior of people who are afraid of every challenge, any challenge to their position. And I think, frankly, especially given the historical lessons, I think they have every right to be afraid. But that's what they are. That's not a behavior of a strong, popular, and self-confident government. You do not fear your opponents if you are.
Speaking of historical lessons, change your hat to that of a Cambridge-trained historian. Let me ask you something that has been on my mind for quite a while. There's a widely shared opinion, a stereotype basically, that Russians long for a strong arm, that their backs are aching for a whip. And with Putin's popularity ratings such as they are, and I want you to address that issue as well, this cliche is back and forth. And yet when you look at the history, in those rare instances when the Russian people were given a more or less free choice, a more or less imperfect choice, however imperfect and more or less informed choice, the story is quite different. And I would like to bring up this excellent book of yours that I always consult, Reformy или Revoluция, Reforms or the Revolution, by Vladimir. It's about the elections to the first Russian Duma, the first Russian more or less freely elected parliament in 1906. And as you tracked it, with all kinds of fascinating details, of course, the plurality of deputies, the party with most deputies in the Duma, was the openly liberal, pro-Western party of constitutional Democrats, Kadety. And then, of course, we've seen this again and again. Over 8 decades passed before the Russians could vote again, more or less freely. And we saw the results in '89 in Moscow. We saw the results in 1990, '91. We saw the referendum of '93, where people voted to continue the reform against the leftist populist Supreme Soviet. And of course, in December '93, again, contrary to the Zhirinovsky stereotype, when you count the deputies elected both on the party list and on the single mandate list, it was, again, sort of the cadets party. 90 years later, it was Yegor Gaidar's Russia's choice. So how would what should we make out of all of this, especially given what's happening now?
Well, I think first of all, as far as the opinion polls and Putin's so-called high support goes, I think it's completely meaningless to talk about opinion polls in a system where every single major television channel is controlled by the state propaganda, where we have now dozens of political prisoners, where we have not mass but targeted but very acute political repressions, where we don't have free elections. When you sit at your house and you get a phone call and some person on the other line asks you, do you support Putin? I think most people would just say yes to be on the safe side and put the phone down. So I think it's frankly meaningless to talk about these so-called 84% that people talk about. But on your deeper question on the stereotype, there is this very popular myth, this urban legend, that Russians are somehow uniquely among other Eastern European nations unsuited for democracy. I think it's a borderline racist argument, frankly. And it's certainly not borne out by the facts. You mentioned the 1906 election, when indeed the cadets won a plurality of seats, and supporters of absolute monarchy did not win a single seat in the State Duma, not one.
Right.
Also, we could mention the 1917 election to the Constituent Assembly, which was held after the Bolsheviks already seized power in a coup d'etat, but the people rejected them in favor of the SRs, the pro-democracy center-left party. And of course, '91, when Boris Yeltsin, the Democratic opposition candidate, beat the official Soviet establishment's candidate, Nikolai Ryzhkov, by 57% to 17, a whopping landslide. So the simple fact is that we are no better and no worse than other Eastern European nations, including Slavic, including Orthodox Christian nations, who once lived under totalitarian dictatorships and now have functioning democracies. And there will come a day when Russia too will have a functioning democracy. And I think what's important to note is that this myth that Russians are somehow unsuited for democracy, not ready for democracy, and all the rest of it, it's being implicitly used by the Kremlin's propaganda machine to imply that any alternative to Putin would be worse,
or
what comes after Putin will be worse, precisely. So I think it's crucial that informed and well-meaning people do not fall for this propaganda ruse.
Well, Volodya, we're doing so well, and your answers are so excellent and concise that we have quite a bit of time to take questions from the floor. Thank you very much for talking with me. Please, questions for Vladimir Kara-Murza? Please. Wait for the microphone and please introduce yourself.
I'm John Gizzi, political correspondent for Newsmax, and it's such an honor to meet you, sir, having heard so much about you from our friend Elena Servitaz, and glad to be in your presence. The Magnitsky sanctions have been applied to so many people, and as Russia, for example, continues to be a presence in Ukraine, and spreads its influence in other countries internationally, people say, why not impose sanctions on Putin? The White House at the regular press briefings have never ruled that out, to sanction him personally. What do you think of that, and would that have an effect on him? One member said, support sanctions on him enough so that the Kremlin itself might overthrow him.
Thank you very much for the question, John. Good to meet you in person too. And you said that there have been many people sanctioned under the Magnitsky law. There have been quite a few, but as I mentioned earlier, they were all low-level operatives. Not a single high-profile, influential person in Putin's circle has been targeted. And I think that was the intention of the law. Again, the double standard at the heart of this regime is that they want to rule, like an oppressive third world dictatorship inside of Russia, but they want to enjoy all the benefits that the free world can offer, including the financial benefits, and that has to stop. And as I alluded to earlier, that this idea is shared by a lot of people in Russia, that this has to stop. There have been some high-profile cases outside of the Magnitsky process. Give just one example. Last year, Mikhail Lesin, who was then head of Gazprom Media, which is the largest state propaganda television outlet, owns NTV and other entities. He had an investigation started against him by the FBI under the Anti-Money Laundering and Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts, because it was found out that he purchased some luxury real estate in California, and the purpose of the investigation is to find out how he was a state official. And he had to resign 2 days afterwards. He resigned last December. He's not in that position anymore. That's just one example of how effective this process can be if it's applied properly, if it's done against the right people. So I think, yes, it would be very important, I think, symbolically, to sanction Putin personally as well as the head of this regime, but even more effective to do it against those people, those state-connected oligarchs around him, that all of them have spare aerodromes, as we call them, right? Spare bases prepared in Western countries, and I think that would be really effective to go after them. And again, it's soon as the 3rd anniversary of the passage and signing of the Magnitsky Law, and I really hope that the administration steps up the implementation, and also that the European Union follows suit. In all our meetings with our counterparts in the EU, members of the European Parliament and so forth, we always raise this issue, that it's really important to do this. They have started to do some sanctions, targeted sanctions, with relation to the aggression on Ukraine. And actually some propagandists have been targeted, like Dmitry Kiselyov, probably the most infamous one.
The one who wanted to turn the United
the US
States
into radioactive ash, exactly.
in the heap of radioactive
Precisely,
ash.
right.
Yes. The host of the most popular television show.
Exactly. Or, well, again, we can talk about popular or not, but it's basically that when you have one dish in a restaurant, you can say it's the most popular dish, and it would be true technically. But also, I think it's a very important point to make. These shouldn't be sanctions against Russia, and they shouldn't be called as such. These should be targeted sanctions against those abusers who engage in both internal repression and external aggression. And sometimes too many Western leaders are careless with the language, and they do call them sanctions on Russia, and I don't think that helps, because that is used by the propaganda machine to say, oh, look, they're against Russian people and all the rest of it. So I think as you step up the implementation of it, it's important to be very careful about the wording and the presentation, frankly, as well.
Please think of more questions. Meanwhile, I'll abuse my host prerogative. Ask you one. Let's delve a little bit deeper, Volodya. Again, putting back your expert hat. You talked a little bit about Syria, but it seems that Ukraine. A frozen conflict. My formula is that the tie goes to Ukraine. A frozen conflict. I'm not sure. This is not Abkhazia. This is not Transnistria. This is to say that I essentially tried and failed is something that this regime I don't think can afford.
Mikhail has missed, right?
Yeah. The sense is that it's not frozen. It's frozen, but Putin controls the access to a microwave. He can always pop it back in. So what do you think? What is the end game in Ukraine? Or we just go day by day?
Well, he can pop it back in, but if you look at what's happening at the moment, they are backing away clearly. The Novorossiya project has failed a long time ago, but now even if you look on the state news programs on Russian state TV, they, for instance, have started again calling them Lugansk and Donetsk regions as opposed to republics, and they've cancelled those so-called elections that were supposed to take place in eastern areas this month. So they are clearly backing away. And this picture from Ukraine, it's not a winning picture for them anymore. It's become a quagmire. It's been a year and a half, and they failed to get all of the eastern part of Ukraine, as was apparently the original plan. They, I hope, will fail to prevent the success of the democratic institutions in Ukraine, which is, again, was their
Of course,
main
it's the goal.
motivation.
Yeah.
If you look at state TV again, the Ukraine is being gradually but completely replaced with Syria. All you hear now about is Syria, Syria, Syria. You almost don't hear about Ukraine. Whereas for the last year, if you looked on state TV, you wouldn't hear anything about Russia, for instance. All you'd hear about is about the Ukrainian fascist junta, in Kiev. So, and that's all changed in the last few weeks.
Just one call for clarification, or perhaps maybe projection. I think, Volodya, you were absolutely right to say that as Mikhail Dmitriev actually told me, a leading Russian political sociologist, long before Crimea, foreign policy is the only thing that's working for this regime. But then, okay, so Ukraine now is being slowly abandoned. Now there's Syria, but if this logic is, Dmitriev's logic, and what I understand is your logic, holds, then there will have to be something after Syria. I mean, this patriotic mobilization has to be. I mean, he saddled the tiger, and the tiger is trotting rather successfully. But you got to feed tiger with meat, and the bloodier the better. So what's the projection there?
I think the thing with those is that at some point it will simply stop working. If we look at our history, small victorious wars never ended well for our dictatorships. Beginning with of course, the Russo-Japanese War, the one that term was invented for.
Where the phrase, pleve, right?
Right, pleve, exactly. And then, Afghanistan again that we mentioned, that helped hasten the demise of the Soviet regime. And even if we look at the First World War, for instance, the patriotic, the pro-monarchist hype that accompanied the beginning of it, and look what happened just 3 years later. So I don't think we can take it, or we should take it for granted that this will continue to work for them and they will just go to next target and next target. If Syria becomes for Putin what Afghanistan became for the Soviet Politburo, then this is the last military adventure he's entered, and it quite possibly one of the last few big things his regime has engaged themselves to.
Anders.
Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. 3 questions, if I may. First, on the Magnitsky Act. We know that the government, the White House, is very happy to sanction people, but not according to the Magnitsky Act. Because the Magnitsky Act means that the Congress has a say over it, and the administration prefers to have it all in its own hands. Shouldn't you focus on the other sanctions instead, given that the White House is so much more happy to do that than under the Magnitsky Act? Shouldn't the Magnitsky Act, for practical reasons, be put on a back burner? Because all White Houses have been burned by the Jackson-Vanik Act that they couldn't get rid for 20 years when it was no longer applicable. Second question, what do you make of the demise of Vladimir Yakunin, the head of the Russian railroads, considered one of the 10 top people around Putin, as a good KGB general from St. Petersburg, and then he just disappears like this. So I would be interested if you elaborate upon it. And from what you talked before about, it would be interesting to hear, how do you think that this regime can fall? Khodorkovsky has told us very firmly that he thinks that this can not fall through elections. And how do you see that this regime could fall, alternative scenarios and probabilities? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. It's great to see you. And I'll start with your last question, if I may. Of course, it's not going to change through elections. We don't have real elections, as you know. We happen to believe that our country's had enough revolutions for the last century, and we wouldn't like to see another one, certainly not a bloody one. But what this regime does, they're doing really the best they can to make sure that when the power does change, as it inevitably will, nothing is permanent, it will do so not on a constitutional, not on a peaceful way. They have this new pro-Kremlin movement called anti-Maidan, right? Presumably it's against revolutions, and they accuse us, the Russian opposition, of wanting a Maidan, wanting a revolution. In fact, I think the biggest supporters and the biggest instigators of a future Russian Maidan are sitting in the Kremlin right now, Because when you shut off every single legal avenue to protest, to express an alternative opinion, when you have no free elections, you have no independent media on a big scale, certainly on television, when you have no working judicial system, you're ensuring that when society does, or the active part of society does have enough of these people, as it will, inevitably, and I think sooner rather than later, it's not going to be peaceful, it's not going to be constitutional. And I'm saying it, I'm not happy about it. I'm saying this, with sorrow. I don't think that's going to be good for anybody. But that's what they're making sure by everything they do. So, yeah, I don't see how the regime can change through elections, since we don't have free elections now. On your question about the Magnitsky Act, sure, they can act. I mean, as you know, the executive here has the authority to sanction anybody anyway. It's a right of the U.S. to give or not to give somebody a visa, so they can just do it anytime they wish. Of course, the reason the Magnitsky Act was passed was because they didn't do it, that they didn't use that authority. And I think it's also important that the Magnitsky Act provides a concrete motivation. It's the human rights abuse, it's the corruption, the graft. There are all these executive actions. As you know, there is President Obama's executive order about Ukraine. There are sanctions applied to those involved in aggression against Ukraine, and they are acting on that too. But I think it's important to have the human rights motivation, because as we know from the founding documents of the OSCE, which bound both Russia and the United States, human rights are not an internal affair, whatever Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov continue to say. The Moscow document of the OSCE clearly states that issues of human rights and fundamental freedoms cannot be considered an internal affair of a member state. So human rights concerns everybody, and I think that's why it's such an important symbolic act. And after all, the majorities were huge and bipartisan, and the president signed it. So I think they should really abide by, a United States federal law. But of course, you're right, they can do it otherwise as well. And if they, for some reason, decide just to sanction people outside of the law, I wouldn't see any problem with it. But of course, I think it'll be more effective if it's under the process. And Yakunin, there's a new version out about Yakunin's sacking. I'm sure you saw it yesterday. It's when his son applied for a British passport, and that was considered a sign of unloyalty, I guess, in the Kremlin or something. But a lot of people are saying that this is the beginning of the fight under the carpet already, and these Kremlin clans that are beginning to clash with each other. And as the crisis deepens, the crisis of the regime deepens, I think we'll see more and more of this. There won't be any friends left in the cooperative ozera, as it were, and I think he may be the first sign of that. And you're right, he just went nowhere. First, he was supposed to be given the conciliatory position of a senator, of course, which is a rubber stamp position in Russia. It's not like senator here, but even that he rejected, as he probably considered it too modest an offer, frankly. And you're right, he's just gone completely nowhere. One of the closest people to Putin, and I think there'll be others to follow. If we remember. Again, the big protests in the end of 2011, we saw what many considered what was the beginning of the split of the elites back then, when we saw, Kudrin on Sakharov Avenue, Prokhorov came in.
Even Surkov said something, remember?
Surkov said these are the best people in the country, right. And that was, unfortunately, that was too short a time, and then the regime regained the initiative and it's been doing what it's been doing since, suppressing and repressing. But once that moment starts again, and I have no doubt it will, I think we'll see some more interesting dynamic at the top there.
Laura, please, and identify yourself. Where's our microphone? No. Jill, right here.
Hi, Vladimir. It's so nice to see you. I'm from the Figaro. I have a question about Europe. You have described the powerful, influence of the propaganda machine inside Russia. What about the Russian propaganda war in Europe? It is being waged daily, as we see, and with quite a lot of success. Actually, we've seen increasing support for Putin throughout Europe, especially countries like France, where you have whole political parties on the extreme right, but also people on the left, and many leaders in the Gaullist party supporting now some kind of alliance, compromise with Putin, and it's only going to increase with this migrants crisis. And Putin seems to have made clear to the Europeans that at some point maybe they're going to have to give up, on sanctions, maybe on Ukraine, if they want this Syrian, mess to stop. Otherwise, he could actually mess it up even more. So, how do you think this is going to play out? I mean, are you worried about this this kind of divide of Europe that Putin seems to be seeking pretty successfully?
Sure, thanks for the question. It's an important one. And of course, while the Kremlin is railing against so-called fascists in Ukraine, it's pretty happy to make friends with the far right in the European Union countries, like you mentioned, the Front National, also the Hungarian far right, and there was recently a big conference of the far right parties from across Europe in St. Petersburg. It was actually held in the same hotel and in the same hall where we, Open Russia, was supposed to host our forum in December, and it was, of course, broken up by police. But with the fascists, they have no problem. That's fine. You're right. Putin is, and the Kremlin is aggressive in trying to split the EU, get his support in the EU, ratchet up the propaganda in EU through RT and other means. I think it's important, first of all, to recognize it, that this is happening, because not everybody does. Some people like to close their eyes on it. It's happening here as well, but to a lesser extent, much more so in the European Union. So I think it's important to recognize it and to recognize that it's not a good thing to do. And actually again, the origins of everything are domestic. And that's why I think it was such a good proposition by the European Union presidency, which was held by Latvia then last year, to create a new Russian language pan-European television channel, which would also be broadcast into Russia itself. I think that's a really important notion, because you have to combat the roots of this propaganda, the heart of it, where it's originating from. But of course, also it's going to be easier for EU countries to try to combat it on their own territory, so at least I think they should be doing that, and not to mix up propaganda with free speech. They're very different things. We heard from critics of the idea, for instance, to include the propagandists, Putin state propagandists, into the targeted sanctions here in this country. And what about the First Amendment? Well, free speech and incitement are different things. And when state employees use state resources and state money to hound political opponents of the regime on national TV, things they said about Boris Nemtsov when he was alive, that he would have welcomed Nazi troops in Moscow in 1941, that he was in the pay of the Americans, that he was a traitor, all the rest of it. You should, it's all, you can see all the quotations. This is not free speech. This is not the First Amendment. And I think when these arguments are being voiced in the EU, these are not correct arguments, frankly. I think propaganda should be recognized and confronted.
Please. Yes.
My name is James Byrne. I'm a longtime journalist here. And something I've paid a lot of attention to in recent years is the very sad demographic reality that is going on in Russia, where male life expectancy is plummeting, and that I've attended a lot of discussions by Russian demographers of this, and I'm wondering what impact will that very bad demographic picture have on the government?
No, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think we have one of the biggest gaps in the world between male and female life expectancy. It's 11 or 12 years. And in fact, that's been a situation since the Soviet times, since the early to mid-1980s. If you take Russia, not the Soviet Union as a whole, Russia. Because, of course, there's this, again, another myth about the horrendous, so-called horrendous 1990s, is that that's when the demographic problems began. No, they began under the Soviet system. And essentially they continue today. The only region which has a surplus, more people born than people are dying, is the North Caucasus, the Muslim regions of southern Russia, which is a whole other subject for discussion as well. How is that going to bode for the future? But I think the bottom line is this regime doesn't care about long-term national interests of Russia, be it what happens inside our country or what happens in relation to our foreign affairs, and all the pieces we'll have to pick up once they're gone, with restoring our position in the world. So that's why these problems are continuing and exacerbating and not getting better. All they care about is to preserve their power. And frankly, I don't think they give even a small thought to the demographic problem that you mentioned. For instance, they're very happy about their opponents leaving the country. And these are, we have a massive brain drain, frankly, in the last few years from Russia. People leaving in great numbers, educated people, intellectual people, because, they cannot stand the atmosphere anymore. I think it's a tragedy. I think, of course, it's not my place. Everybody decides for their own life, but I think it's a tragedy that so many such people are leaving. But they're happy about it, the regime, because, fewer troublemakers, easier to control who's left. I still think they're doomed. I still think they're going to fail, but that's what they're doing.
Anna Aslan.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, for those who don't know, in front of you are two of people from Russia who are probably some of the most cultured and educated in topics of Russian culture, not just politics and all this stuff that we're all fond of. So, and this is my question to Vladimir. Vladimir, please, after my short comment, prove me wrong. Please, I really want to be proven wrong. So in 1825, a bunch of young, noble, heroic aristocrats, pretty much looking like Vladimir, decided, I guess some of your ancestors...
Without the cane, though. Right.
Decided that the regime was awful, unfair, which it was, and they all ended up in Siberia or being hung, right? In 1827, Pushkin wrote a poem which sounded very much like what we heard from Vladimir. Не пропадет наш скорбный труд, иду высокое стремление, that the prisons will collapse and the freedom will meet you at the gate. 1827. 110 years later, we know Stalin's purges happened, right? And on and on and on. To make it short, some 20 years ago, I would say everything Vladimir said, because I was also young. I really wanted to believe that this time is different. And so Vladimir is now saying this. He's in the US. Leon, as I said, one of the most cultural people, he's in the US. I'm actually an American citizen since 2005. Who's there? I mean, why would that happen? Please prove me wrong. I think everyone who has potential is either in prison or killed or immigrated. You travel in regions. When I traveled in regions 20-something years ago, I was afraid I'll be murdered and decapitated when they heard that I was Gaidar's press secretary. And he was on the stage, and I thought, oh my God, he has bodyguards, I don't, because people were fueling with hatred. So you travel. Do you see these young people maybe in the region, somebody who is ready to burn and continue this for another, I don't know how much it takes, 100, 200 years?
Thanks for the question. It's a really deep one and important one. And of course, to your last point, time goes much quicker now. And those Decembrists you mentioned, those who are still alive, as you know, were freed and returned in one of the first symbolic acts of Alexander II in 1855. And they did return to St. Petersburg. They were old, but that was a symbolic move. But time goes faster now. I don't think it's going to take another 30 years. Well, certainly not another 74 years. And I think Vladimir Khodorkovsky made this comment once, and I think it's right to the point that he says what always surprises me in a good way is that however much repression there is, and however strong the dictatorship is, however many people leave or are imprisoned or are killed, there always remain people in Russia who are European-minded, who want a normal future based on rule of law, on democracy, on respect for the dignity of a human being. There are always such people. And as I travel around the country, I see them. I see them especially among the young generation. I wouldn't say it's the majority of the young generation, because the young generation has really been, I think, the main victim of this horrible propaganda campaign that Putin's regime has been unleashing for the past 10, 15 years. But there are many of them, and they are there, and our job, for instance, the main task of the Open Russia movement is try to support and consolidate those people who want a European future for our country. And Bukovsky is right. Always at every generation there are enough people. And we remember, as you alluded to, in '91 when the putschists had everything. They had the whole state apparatus. They had all the television channels, by the way. They had the Communist Party. They had the KGB, one of the most feared organizations in the history of the world. But when 200,000 people came out and stood in front of the tanks and refused to leave, they failed. The putschists, the coup leaders, failed. And I think, frankly, that's the destiny of all of those who want to drag our country back to the Middle Ages, back to suppression under different guises and forms. It may take some time. The price may be high. It's already really high. We already lost so many people, and we lost Boris this year. And these last few months have been really, really dark. But there was a famous saying that Soviet dissidents like to say, "The night is darkest before the dawn," and I believe that. I still believe that freedom and justice will prevail in the end in Russia. And you said I'm in the U.S. I'm recuperating in the U.S. after what happened. But once I recover further, I will go back, and I will resume my work as coordinator of Open Russia. Because as we discussed, this is our job. No one is going to do it for us. And I believe that freedom and justice will prevail. And I think we have to do everything we can to bring that day a little bit closer.
Please, right there. And then you.
Yes, I'm Russell King, retired federal employee. I have a question about Putin's naval intentions. When Putin took over Sevastopol, I can't help thinking he must have had naval intentions because that's where the Black Sea Fleet is based. And as I understand it, I believe that Ukraine had leased that base to Russia, and there might have been a limit on the number of ships, and once Russia took over, I think maybe that limit disappears. And the terms of transit going through the Turkish Straits are much, much better for Russia than for the United States, because I believe it's governed by the Montreux Convention of the mid-1930s, and it gives preferential transit privileges to Black Sea nations, which would include Russia, would include Ukraine. But I don't believe it accounts for the fact that you might have an act of war of one Black Sea nation against another. And I would think that the Black Sea Fleet would supply Syria, and I believe that the port there might be Tartus. And in the Arctic, the United States and NATO has none of its own icebreakers. I think we're totally dependent upon Norwegian and Danish icebreakers in the NATO area. But with the Russian Northern Fleet, they're very active, and the Northern Sea Route, I believe, is now functioning for local shipping, and may in a few years possibly even be an international sea route, in which case I think it would be the shortest distance between Europe, North America, and East Asia. And also, due to the warming, there are some resource grabs in international waters in the Arctic. So I'm wondering, can you tell me a little bit about the Russian naval intentions and what the U.S. response should likely be?
Sure, thanks for it's an interesting question. I'm not a naval expert, although my father-in-law is a naval officer, so probably should be. But I would say that we already saw, with this Syria operation going on now, we saw some strikes from the Caspian Sea 2 days ago, and there actually are some questions raised as to whether or not these were medium-range missiles that would violate the 1987 treaty between the U.S. and the U.S.
Russia effectively abrogated that treaty.
Right.
So it's,
and happy to show it.
Right.
But I think, again, that everything that happened with Crimea, for instance, it wasn't primarily about gaining the fleet. We had the fleet there anyway. As you say, it was until 2017 was the current agreement, but it probably would have been prolonged. But I think it had domestic, mainly propaganda objectives. And it worked for the regime for about a year, I guess. It's worn off now, the effect, but it worked for about a year, this hype. So I don't think, my main point is I don't think what they do is primarily directed to foreign policy and strategic goals. Again, it's to preservation of their power inside the country. If they'll need military adventures and they think that will help them, they will do it, as we saw with Ukraine, as we see with Syria. I'm sure they'll be happy to use naval resources too. And of course, you said that the limits on the Black Sea Fleet are gone. Well, everything that happens in Crimea now is technically illegal since the annexation. Nothing is according to convention and law anymore. So, sure, it could be done. Anything could be done. But again, I think we have to look for domestic motivations, domestic factors, and the answers to the problems are also domestic.
over there. somebody was very patient. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Katie Fox. I'm from the National Democratic Institute. It's also very nice to see you and to see you in good health, I hope. I have a couple of questions about the organized opposition to Putin or what might potentially succeed him. My two questions are, how strong is the alternative to Putin on the far right, the sort of nationalist leaders? How likely are they to succeed him? And my other question is, can you address another myth about Russia, which is that the more liberal democratic opposition, of which you are part, tends to shoot itself in the foot by internal infighting and general elitism and disorganization?
Right. Thanks a lot for the questions, Kate. It's good to see you. Well, I think it's an accepted truth that fascists are generally more organized than liberals. So to your last point, I think it is a problem. And what we at Open Russia try to do, and Open Russia is not a party, it's an umbrella movement. It's an organization that tries to consolidate. And when I work with people in the regions, these are people from far just only from Parnas people. These are also people from Yabloko, from other smaller parties. Without any party affiliation is a big part of people we work with. So we're trying to at least try to remedy that a little bit. And we have seen in recent years some hopeful moves on consolidation. We've seen this new democratic coalition, for instance, being created this spring, which was, of course, barred from the ballot in most places it was supposed to run, as I mentioned earlier. But, I'm hoping that I wish this lesson would have been learned sooner. I think 2003 was a decisive year when if SPS and Yabloko had been together in one bloc, the whole history of Russia would have been different after that. But we have what we have. But we're trying to learn. I'm with you on this. I think it doesn't make any sense that we're not consolidated, and I personally and my colleagues I know will do everything we can to try to achieve it. But of course, at critical points, I think we are. Like in the protests in 2011, 2012, everybody was on Bolotna, everybody was on Sakharov. It was people from Yabloko, from Parnas, from other parties, from no parties at all. Actually, most people were not from any parties at all. So I still hope we're going to get there. And in terms of nationalists, the Kremlin has done a lot to nurture and to grow up this nationalist itself. For instance, with what it's been doing in Ukraine. These guys are now coming back, so-called Novorossiya volunteers. And the Kremlin is going to soon find, I think, that they're not actually very much supporters of it, as many people originally told them when they started doing it. But they have been toying with the nationalists abroad. We mentioned this European Fascists Conference that was held in St. Petersburg. It's been toying with nationalism inside. One of the nationalist firebrands, Rogozin, is a member of Putin's government, was appointed in 2012. So the Kremlin's been toying and thinking it could control it. Of course, the problem with all these movements is they often go out of control. And therein, I think, lies a danger, not just for this regime, but for our country as a whole. But I still not just believe, but I know from my experience with dealing with a lot of people, including outside of Moscow, outside of St. Petersburg, that this far right, they don't have genuine strong popularity. They do not. And when, for instance, the big protest movement of 2011, 2012, it was unified, right? It included everybody, including nationalists. But when the Levada Center did a big survey of Bolotna and Sakharov, I found that the nationalists accounted for 6%, just 6% of the unified protesters. So I think it's hyped up to more than what it actually is. But I also think there is a danger, but that danger is coming from the top, not from the bottom. So it's not genuine support that these far-right forces have in Russian side. I don't think they have. But it's the fact that the Kremlin opportunistically toys with them, and that could be a potential source of a problem. There's one in the back there. Very
Oh, yes, somebody in the back, please.
Thank you. Emma Louise Leahy from Denton's, and I had two questions about Russia's relationships in the Middle East. One is after the nuclear deal and with Russia and Iran both supporting the Assad regime in Syria, what do you see as the future of the Russian-Iranian relationship? And the other, to what extent is Putin concerned about losing standing in the Sunni world as a result of his support for Assad? Thank you.
And actually, Valery, this was one of the questions, if I could piggyback also, add to this. Your second one is extremely important. their foreign ministry estimates that there are 2,400 fighters from Russia itself among ISIS, and up to 5,000 of Russian speakers, and that of course includes Central Asia. We add to this the fact that the most recruitment occurs in Moscow and in Russia rather than in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And the fact that eventually, one way or another, in fact, Putin alluded to that in his speech at the UN, that they tasted blood, they'll be coming back. I think this could be an issue of enormous importance. So if you could, address that,
Absolutely.
first of all, Iran, just to recap, Russia's goal in the Middle East, and then finally this issue of Sunnis that Putin is frankly desperately afraid of because of the Central Asia connection, and because those regimes, once Taliban is undermined successfully, which I think is only a matter of time, of Afghanistan, Central Asia will begin to fall. And given the fact that there are about 5 million migrant workers only legally registered in Russia from Central Asia, that could be an enormous problem for the regime.
Absolutely, but I think, and thanks for the question, I think that's a classic case of where, the Syria adventure is a classic case of where the regime is trying to preserve its own power at the expense of the long-term interests of our country. This is not the only, place they're doing it, but that's certainly, I think, one of the most visible ones. Of course, the majority of Russian Muslims are Sunnis.
Right.
And we've already seen Saudi Sunni clerics declaring jihad against Russia earlier this week as a result of the intervention in Syria. There is talk of potential consequences, frankly, with regard to terrorism in Russia itself, with regard to events in the North Caucasus, which has been volatile anyway.
Right.
And none of this bodes well for our country and for our long-term national interest. And again, I think that's one of the most classic cases where they choose their own self-preservation, or short-term even as well at that. The propaganda effect that it's going to give them for a few months at the expense of the long-term interests of Russia. In terms of our position in the Middle East, this regime is continuing with, essentially what the Soviet foreign policy was in the Middle East, with the exception that we still have diplomatic relations with Israel. The Soviet Union did not. But, again, usually that's a bad we. The Kremlin regime gives Israel a cold shoulder usually, and it's trying to be friendly with the regime in Tehran. We saw General Soleimani come to Moscow a few weeks before the beginning of the operation in Syria. I think it's very possible that they were discussing it as well. And of course now we're officially in a coalition with the regime in Tehran, just as we are with, the Kremlin regime, with the regime of Assad and so on. So I think this is the model they're continuing with. I don't think it's the right one, frankly. I mean, I'm one of those who believes that our natural alliances lie in the Western world. Russia's a European nation. Our natural allies are our neighbors in Europe. And if we're talking about the Middle East, it should be the only genuine democracy in the Middle East, which is Israel. And I think a future Russian government that is democratic will be doing that, just as we began to do it in the 1990s for a brief time. But for now, we have to unfortunately state that that's the foreign policy and that's the alliance policy of this regime. It's Iran, Assad, and this club of dictators that we mentioned earlier.
Volodya, just wanted to thank you again, and I think I speak for everybody in this hall, in this audience, that we just in admiration of your personal heroism and the heroic work you're doing in Russia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.